As we at Stagen think about the call to adventure, and a lot of people will say, I don't know what I should be doing with my life. I hear Rick Voren talk about Mary Oliver. What are you going to do with this one wild and precious life? The fierce urgency of now. What am I going to do with my life? And Parker Palmer, who I mentioned, is a fan of the Mobius strip because of its ability to really bring to the surface the hidden wholeness of life. He actually says the question of what am I going to do with my life might not be the best question. A better question is, what does your life want to do with you? What does your life want to do with you? But if we're not able to hear what our life is saying, what the call to adventure is saying, because the busyness and the urgency and the chaos and the attachments, if we can't be quiet enough to actually hear the message that's there all the time, the two most important days of your life, the day you are born and the day you find out why. And people will say, but I don't know why. And one of the answers is, can you hear it? And people keep looking outside as opposed to realizing that they already have access to the answer to question number 2. Why are you here? If we can quiet down enough. And Albina said, we need to learn to quiet so we can actually hear. And Corey said about Albina that there's a magic to her approach to life. It's magical. And so we find ourselves in this moment of a call for leadership. And now I'm going to make this bigger than me, bigger than you, bigger than Stagen. Our country and our world is at a place that is incredibly conflicted. There is not just polarization, there is hyperpolarization. And people say, Rand, are you hopeful about the demand for leadership development? And unfortunately, because I would never have asked for the last 2 years of all the pain and the challenge and how that has surfaced so much of the fractures, and I'll just stay to America in our country. But now I realize, and this isn't about Stagen, what the world needs right now more than any time in my lifetime, in my experience, is leadership. What the world needs is us. And the world needs us to be able to lead in a particular way that unfortunately is an emergent leadership capability. When I say emergent, I mean it doesn't exist. So when someone says, can you give me an example? Can you point to a company? Can you point to a person? It's very difficult to find illustrations of the kind of leadership that we assert that the world needs right now. And there goes by a lot of names. It goes by conscious leadership. It goes by integral leadership. It goes by next level leadership. I'm going to give you another way of thinking about this in just a moment. But I want to clear something that most of you are already familiar with from a standpoint of the conflict today, the polarization today. I would invite you to imagine that it's not actually a political conflict. It's not a black-white conflict. It's not a rich-poor conflict. Those are all on the surface. The conflict is a worldview conflict. What we're seeing right now, especially the right-left divide, politically, on the surface, is a worldview conflict. So let's remind you, kind of go back to what you already learned in the Integral Leadership Program, on the 3 dominant worldviews, and we'll use the same colors from the Integral Leadership curriculum, and we're going to use slightly different language. The first worldview, orange, we're going to use the term modernist. Steve McIntosh helped me. He's a thought leader. He runs the Institute for Cultural Evolution in Boulder. He's one of a handful of guests. Some of you have met him. And he's been working with me the last couple of years, really since George Floyd's murder, to understand how to make sense of this. And he's like, Rand, you use achiever at Stagen? And that's one label, but another label for this might be modernist. Those who are the recipients of modernity, the Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern science, modern healthcare. Mike Howard talked about so many of the wonderful things that are occurring in increasing life expectancy, decreasing infant mortality. Modernity. Modernity has, and I've just given some examples, some wonderful dimensions that, well, let's call those the light of modernity. Does that make sense? The good things that are coming from modernity. But where there is light, there is shadow. Where there is light, there is shadow. And this is a really important point that we want to get across. Where there is light, there is shadow. And what are some of the shadows of modernity? Things like greed, things like self-dealing, things like environmental destruction, real environmental destruction. Oh, wow, look at all these manufacturing plants with smokestacks, but look at what's happening to the water that their waste is going into. So there is the shadow there. Now, in addition to modernity, and these last two are a little bit more intuitive, the traditionalists. This is the worldview of traditionalism. And there are some wonderful light dimensions of traditionalism. Things like the rule of law, things like law and order, things like family values, very healthy. However, where there is light, there is shadow. And the traditionalists have a shadow just like the modernists. Their shadow might include things like fundamentalism, things like anti-science. And so, light and shadow. Now, what's come onto the scene in the last 15 years in a meaningful way is now the progressive worldview. And the progressive worldview has really important, beautiful light that has been coming online for 40 or 50 years in the US. What Martin Luther King stood for, and the civil rights movement, and the ability for all Americans to be able to vote. All of this they are examples of the healthy part of progressivism and the care for the environment, the recognition that we need to protect the world, we need to protect the natural environment, we need to set up land that's set aside from business, we need to set up national parks and forests, we need to protect our world. Those are beautiful, wonderful things, but there's also a shadow in everything. And the shadow of progressivism, let's give some examples. Right now, a shadow of progressivism is something academically referred to as anti-modernity. To be against modernity. We are modernists. Therefore, the pathology of progressivism, I want to be very clear. Now, I'm not being critical of any of the worldviews. I'm being critical of the pathology of all of the worldviews. The pathology would look at us gathering here, getting on airplanes to come here, exploiting people as our employees to make money and extract money and be capitalists. They would see us as the villains in the story. It is not helpful to see modernity as the villain when modernity has contributed so much to the beauty and to the advancement of the human race, nor would it be appropriate to villainize the progressives or the traditionalists, because all three have something beautiful and positive to contribute. And all three have something ugly and pathological in the shadow. Is this making sense? Okay, just really simple. Light and shadow, three worldviews. And another example of the shadow of progressivism, because we want to give you a sense of what might be going on when you're confused about, especially around race, like what's happening in America and why is there so much shaming and blaming going on. The shadow of progressivism can at times include something called reverse patriotism. I'd never heard that term, reverse patriotism. What does that mean? Reverse patriotism is actually to be not just, I'm not patriotic, I'm neutral, I'm actually against America. I think that America is rotten to its core, irredeemably rotten. That's not helpful. That's not helpful for our fellow Americans to be pointing to our country and the founding of our country and saying it's irredeemably bad. That's just not going to help. It's not going to create healing. It's not going to integrate. And so I want you to imagine which, quote, camp, it's a little oversimplified, but which camp you may see yourself in, which camp you may see your friends, your neighbors, your community in. And now imagine when they're criticizing the other worldviews, the other camps, most of the time, they're only seeing one thing in the other. They're seeing the shadow. So I see the shadow, I see the shadow, I see the shadow, and I don't see the light. And so often, and Steve and I talked about this, often what I naively, even just 2 years ago, I was like, There's got to be a way that the leaders of the Stagen community, the leaders of the conscious capitalism community, and the leaders of other communities who want to be a part of the solution, there's got to be a way that we can find common ground. We've got to be able to find common ground. What I'm learning is that while common ground has some attributes that are beautiful, that are almost sacred at their foundation, that in the polarization of today, that common ground actually would require a level of compromise from all three. Let's even just take blue and green. And so when you have green and blue, and you say, let's come and meet in the middle, and let's compromise, and let's get the modernists in there too, and we're all gonna find common ground, what's left is something that is a dilution of what existed before. This is the big idea I'm about to hopefully invite you into. That is, what's left at common ground is the dilution of what was there before, because there's three worldviews. Each worldview gives something up. What's left is a dilution of what was there before. What if, instead of striving for common ground, what if we could aspire to a more elevated vision of higher ground? And what if, from a place of higher ground, we could recognize that the pathologies are problematic from all three? And what if we could reduce the pathologies, try to eliminate as much as possible the pathologies, and then go to each of the worldviews and say, in an inclusive way, we are all Americans, we are all human beings, however you want to do your circle of inclusion. What if your circle of inclusion had no conditions? So often I talk to people and they're like, it's all about inclusion. And I'm like, great, it's all about inclusion, but what about the people who actually see the world differently than you? And they're like, well, they're not allowed to be included. And I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense, because your inclusion is conditional based on your worldview. As long as they see the world the way I see the world, they're included. And so until they see the world the way I see the world, they will not be included. It's a conditional form of inclusion as opposed to unconditional inclusion. I am not suggesting in a warm and fuzzy way that we should include everything from the worldviews. We should not include the pathologies, the shadows of any of the three. We should not include the pathologies, but we should include the human beings, and we should include all of the light of all three. And we should try to contribute each of those dimensions that only these three can contribute. The progressives are the only worldview that can contribute the light of progressivism. The modernists are the only worldview that can contribute the light of modernity. And the traditionalists are the only worldview that can contribute the light of traditionalism. And if we could bring all of that into and integrate it into a more complex, into a more nuanced understanding, what would be is something that has never been before. This is why it's called emergent. I've shown this slide to people in the last few months, and they're like, Rand, this is so great. Can you send me your white paper and your article and the books? Because I want to see a list of all the companies that are at higher ground. I want to see a list of all the leaders that are at higher ground. And what I say is, they don't exist yet. What exists before the leadership capability, what exists is the need for the leadership capability. The world is telling us right now, through the pain of the world, through the pain in our organizations, the world is telling us that the world needs leaders. And the world needs leaders to step in and step up to higher ground. But where are they? They're right in this room. They're right here. And I have been looking and looking and looking. People have been calling about diversity and inclusion training. Rand, where is the higher ground, yellow diversity and inclusion training? Just give us the name of the consulting firms, because we want to vet them. And I was like, I'll go and look. And our whole team has been looking. And we called the think tank that Steve runs, and we called other think tanks, and we called all sorts of people, East Coast, West Coast, Europe. Can't find. They're out there, but we can't find them. And what I realized is, this is our call collectively, not just Stagen as a community, but leaders. This is our call to adventure, the ultimate call to adventure, to step in. Excited as I am about the contributions of the DEI, or the diversity and inclusion work that's happening, and there's really good and important work happening all over the country, it is centered in progressivism. And in its shadow, it tends to or it can be exclusionary to, especially traditionalism and modernity. And that's not helpful. And so I'm not about attacking or criticizing that movement, that industry. I think that movement and that industry is really important. And it is provoked in me. The progressive part of it has provoked in me this set of questions. So here's the call to all of us. And I'll use a quote that many of you are familiar with. If not us, who? If not us, who? If not now, when? Who's going to do it? I'm just turning off now. It's like, oh, it's an easy button. I'll just join this camp. This camp is kind of the closest camp to my resonance. I'll just join that camp. That's the easy button, to just subordinate to the narrative of that camp and join the echo chamber. And I talked to several people just in the last few days, a few of you here, that said, Rand, I'm so fatigued, I'm so overwhelmed, I'm not going to join any camp, I'm out. It's a fourth camp, I'm out. Anyone relating with this? Like I'm going to be Antoine, just fuck it, okay? All right? I'm out. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to stop watching the news. I'm going to stop reading media. I'm just out. If everybody who has leadership potential chooses to join one of the three camps or chooses out, we are going to stay in this intractable hot mess. We're not getting out of it. The only way out of this, I'm going to assert this today, tomorrow, next week, next year. The only way out of this is leadership. If not us, who? If not now, when? So with that, big round of applause for all our speakers this morning.